Sorcerous Stab at Orphen is one of my favourite anime series of all time. After becoming obsessed with the show as a child, I was delighted to learn that it was getting a reboot this year in the winter season of anime releases. Orphen, at time of recording, is now 3 episodes deep into its reboot, and there's already a significant amount of differences from the original 2001 release. Yes, I know technically it was released in 1998 if you're from Japan, but I'm not, so I'm talking about the English version. I wanted to do standalone reviews of the 2020 episodes of Orphen, and I still might do that because, you know, content. But considering there's only a couple of episodes and not a huge amount has happened, it's quite difficult to review them as they are. I figured one of the ways we could review it was to compare the first episodes of the 2020 reboot to the first episodes of 2001, comparing art style, narrative structure, pacing, and other differences. So here we go, Sorcerous Stab at Orphen 2020 versus 2001. Let's begin. By the way, for sake of ease, I'm going to be referring to the new one as 2020 and the old one as 2001. Aside from the drastic changes of art style, the first difference I noticed is how 2020's plot begins. 2020 drops you immediately into the tragic night that sets up Orphen's entire backstory. Orphen's lifelong friend Azali becoming brutally transformed into a massive beast at the hands of a magical artifact known as the Sword of Boltanders. If you want to hear more about that backstory in a short, concise video, I've actually made an in 3 minutes video of the backstory of Sorcerous Stab at Orphen, so if you'd like to check that out, I'll leave it in the cards and in the description below. In 2001, however, we get a far softer opening involving Cleo, who we're yet to be introduced to, bathing in a lake and spotting Orphen silhouetted against the full moon. The sweeping visuals and swelling score immediately set a tone for the series and introduces you to your protagonist in a beautifully scenic way. We then cut to a quiet, almost tense sequence of Orphen displaying his powers to his new apprentice Magic. Interestingly, in 2020, Magic isn't actually Orphen's apprentice yet, and it's something that gets discussed more as the series goes on. This scene is actually a big display of how the English localization differs drastically from the 1998 original Japanese version. In the Japanese version of the original anime and the 2020 version, Orphen's spells operate very differently to how they do in the English dub. Orphen explains in episode 2 of 2020 that it's important to use your voice as a medium in order to create sorcery. He also goes on to mention that he could shout something random and it would still activate. It's these poetic spell commands that the 2001 dub completely ignores. Instead of shouting commands like,
I repair thee, scars of the sunset,
or
I unsheath thee! Come now, sword of light!
to cast spells, the localization instead changes it to things like,
All right then, come on!
Or the main change from the first shot we see of Orphen and Magic,
Let's play Spin the Bottle.
whereas it should say, These are arguably the most disappointing changes to the 2001 localization. I'm really glad to see the 2020 version go into detail on how the voice operates the spells. It's also great to see that the English dub didn't try to escape with horrible translations and late 90s cool phrases, and has instead followed the same poetic command format, even if they have to change it slightly to fit the mouth flaps. Make-believe magic aside, there's an interesting difference in the general pacing of the series' important plot points. As I mentioned earlier, in 2020 you learn about Azali's transformation right off the bat. However, in the 2001 dub, you aren't introduced to Azali until the final seconds of episode 1. Encroaching darkness, scythe-wielding spirits, and black lightning all forebodingly accompany the arrival of what the people in the show refer to as the Bloody August. After a brief and horribly localized exchange between Orphen and these spirits, the Bloody August reveals its hulking, terrifying red-eyed form descending from the clouds. We hear Orphen call out to the beast, saying,
I've waited for you all this time. 5 years since I left the Tower of Fame. 5 long years I've searched for you!
Before he then speaks aloud a name, not of the Bloody August, but of his lifelong friend,
Azali.
As a child and even as an adult, I feel that this scene is incredibly well paced and gives Azali's dragon form a really threatening aura. The Bloody August feels more like an actual beast than the green, almost goofy looking dragon that we see in 2020. In 2001, we don't find out what happened with Azali and the Sword of Boltanders until episode 8. However, we do get suggestions about what happened from Orphen in episode 2.
Why does the Bloody August want the Sword of Boltanders so badly?
Because this sword holds the power to change her from the Bloody August into Azali.
I can see how the 2020 dramatic opening could be seen as exciting, and sets up the story immediately for a new generation with shorter attention spans. However, I personally prefer the gradual establishment of the world, the characters, and ultimately the reason for Orphen's quest. The reveals feel more earned and punctuates the story beats in a more interesting way than being told all you need to know out of the gate. Admittedly, this is actually a closer adaptation of the first light novel, in which during the prologue we see the same events unfold as we do in episode 1 of 2020. If you want to experience the prologue, I actually recorded an audiobook version of it just to give people a sample of what the light novels are, as I know most people realistically wouldn't have read them, so if you'd like to check that out, I'll put that up in the cards and also in the description as well. On the topic of the light novels, it's interesting to see that the entire plot of 2001 is basically summed up in 3 episodes in the reboot, which is actually quite similar to how the light novels play out. The Azali plotline is in fact quite a short arc, and it was turned into an entire series for the 2001 release. Whilst this is exciting for the possibility of further adaptations of the light novel down the line, it's slightly disappointing that we didn't get that time to breathe and dwell on some of the plot points. In episode 15 of 2001, there's a dramatic change of events that's shown to the audience that doesn't pay off until the penultimate episode of the entire series. During a battle with Master Childman, Azali uses her rare gift in white magic to transfer her soul from the body of the Bloody August into Childman. This creates one of the most exciting reveals in the entire series. The slow, methodical deceptions from Azali as Childman and the slip-ups that give away her identity are almost Death Note levels of exciting. Episode 3 of 2020 features this reveal and instantly brings the arc to a close. That being said, the reveal of Childman being in the body of the dragon is a lot more harrowing and tragic in 2020, being told simply via text as we watch Orphen react. Whilst the story it tells is virtually the same, it's definitely lost a lot of the impact that the 2001 version has with these kind of moments in the narrative. It would have been nice to see this play out in a more considered way rather than in a way that made it feel a bit more rushed. Speaking of rushed, the first episode of 2020 also features this brief subplot where Vulcan and Dorton convince Orphen to try and con the rich family of socialites, called the Everlastings, into marrying one of their daughters so they can earn some of the inheritance in order for Vulcan and Dorton to pay back Orphen the money that they've lent him. Yes, I'm serious. This complicated but comedic subplot basically acts as a device to get them within range of the Sword of Boltanders, which is kept in the Everlasting's care. In 2001, the difference here isn't a case of conning as much as voyeurism. Orphen and Magic spend a lot of days watching over the Everlasting Mansion, which Orphen is aware holds the Sword of Boltanders, which when Cleo unsheathes, ends up summoning the Bloody August. This sequence features an awesome shot of Orphen catching the sword as Cleo tries to strike him, throwing her to the floor, and then confronting the massive dragon. 2020 sees the Bloody August burst into the Everlasting's mansion and taking the sword, something she doesn't achieve until much later in the 2001 version. During a battle between Azali and various sorcerers from the Tower of Fangs, Orphen saves Azali with one of his signature spells, and she escapes with the sword clutched in her talons, with the members of the tower hot on her dragony heels. On that note, one of the better elements in 2020 that we get is a lot more establishment of the sort of training that the sorcerers go through at the Tower of Fangs, the prestigious magical academy that Orphen and Azali were both trained at. In 2001, we get only dark, gloomy glimpses of the tower and the odd flashback of reading books, whereas in 2020, we get to see the grounds of the tower in much greater detail. We're also introduced to Orphen's former classmates, like Hartia, Comicron, Forte, Letitia, their powerful teacher Master Childman, and of course, Azali in her human form. In 2001, the only characters you're introduced to are Hartia, Childman, and some of the elders of the Tower of Fangs, but their intentions are shadowed in mystery, instead portraying them more as enemies of Orphen who are seemingly conspiring against him to stop him from returning Azali to her true form. This comes to a head during a scene where Hartia confronts Orphen, warning him not to make the tower his enemy. This is followed by a beautifully animated fight scene, which again features horrific localization of the spells used in the fight.
Do it! If you can! I shall! You shall lose!
In episode 3 of 2020, we get to see a clash between Orphen and Hartia, which features similar use of darkness spells and light spells. However, the scene is over in a matter of seconds, unlike 2001, which again feels more dramatically paced. Despite it being a scene with a lot more brevity, it was exciting to see a clash between two sorcerers in the new updated art style. The very contrasting blacks and whites and the speed and fluidity that came with the modern aesthetic were genuinely exciting to witness, even if it was over faster than you can say,
You shall lose! lose.
Speaking of art style, that's certainly something that's been changed. Whether that's for the better is entirely down to personal preference. Obviously, the general aesthetic of anime has drastically shifted over the decades, and this is reflected in some of the visual updates taking place in 2020's art style. In 2001, the spells cast were simply Dragon Ball-esque blasts or auras of light, whereas in 2020, we see that the spells have adopted a kaleidoscopic, almost Doctor Strange-inspired magical circle that appears around the user's hands. Personally, I'm a fan of the understated nature of the sorcery that we saw in 2001, but I do think the unique direction that they've taken the spells in 2020 to have a more mystical appearance is a nice touch. The original art from 2001 does have a grittier and more foreboding feel to it, but the eye-popping saturation and fluidity of the 2020 version is a welcome change that does help bring new life to the visuals of the series. It'll be interesting to see how these visuals are taken the further we get into the series. Like I said, we've already seen a brief exchange between two sorcerers, i.e. in the fight between Heartier and Orphen, but it would be nice to see a more drawn-out fight sequence later in the series. It's only natural that a reboot of a series doesn't necessarily hit all of the same narrative beats as its original, but it's interesting to see just how differently the two series try to tell the same story. Personally, I do prefer how 2001 handles a lot of the plot points that we've seen so far, both in terms of pacing and in terms of the more serious tone. That being said, the original does feature some pretty funny dialogue, and 2020 is managing to capture some of that comedic style in the reboot, so points for humour. If you've not seen Sorcerous stab at Orphen's original anime, I highly recommend giving it a watch. It's only 24 episodes long, and it's completely worth every minute. I would also recommend these, the manga volumes that were released last year, which tell the same story as the first 3 episodes. They're very short, the art is amazing, and it tells a really exciting and quite funny story, so I highly recommend checking these out. I'm curious to hear which of the two series fans of Orphen prefer, the 2001 original or the 2020 reboot. Although knowing how much people like to whinge and complain on social media these days, I can imagine people have found plenty of reasons to hate the new series. Let me know in the comments section which you prefer and why. I'd be very fascinated to hear what other fans have to say and open up a dialogue about my favourite series. Whether the show has been improved with a 20-year hiatus or not remains to be seen as the episodes continue, but the bottom line is I'm very excited to see the story I grew up with expanded on in such a way. I'm also thrilled to think that this could bring a whole new generation of fans to the series, and hopefully we'll get to see further adaptations of the stories in the Orphen universe for the years to come. Thanks very much for watching this rambly video essay of 2020 versus 2001. If you guys have enjoyed this video, I highly recommend you subscribe to GameHog. We've got lots more Orphen content coming up, whether it's reviews of episodes, whether it's let's plays of the video game, or whether it's further video essays like this. So thank you very much all of you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next Orphen video. Take care, byesies.